Hello and welcome to Show Studio. My name is Dal Chodha, and today, as part of our live panel discussions, we're working with the following Central St Martin's graduates, fresh graduates who have got a lot to say and have got some incredible work that hopefully they're going to explain to us in a second. Today, we are going to be talking about this idea of negotiating gender and sexuality in fashion, which is a super broad topic to cover in 40 to 45 minutes, but we're going to give it a go. But before we get into everything, I want you to meet our panelists, starting with Bailey, please.
Hey, I'm Bailey Slater. I do fashion journalism at CSM, and I made a publication called Fag Mag, which is like gay inspired about the 2000s, basically.
Gay 2K, right? That was the kind of thing. We'll get into that in a minute. Federico.
Yeah, I'm Federico, and I'm graduating from Fashion Communication and Promotion, and my publication is called Sebastian, and it's a mix of fashion, art, and gay history.
Zaina.
Hi, my name is Zaina. I just graduated from Fashion Communication and Promotion. My final project is actually a film, not a publication, but it looks into definitions of kind of gender and sexuality in terms of culture as well.
Great. Zani?
Hi, I'm Zani. I'm graduating from Fashion History and Theory, and my dissertation focused on expressions of regressive masculinity and ideas of hegemonic masculinity and the gangster myth in film and television.
And lastly, Daisy.
Hi, I'm Daisy. Also graduating from Fashion History and Theory this year, and my thesis looked at the Susaban gangs in 60s Japan and their subsequent cultural influence and impact.
So I think what is kind of significant, I guess, that the idea of gender and sexuality are both so big. I wondered with any of you, were they topics that you knew you immediately wanted to cover in your final major projects? Bailey.
Yeah, not gonna lie, definitely. I think a lot of my writing is sort of about being gay just because it's what I know, and I feel like I've got like I guess I could speak on it way better than anything else.
Yeah.
I just thought, for me, I just wanted to be sort of like a gay older brother for like younger teenagers who might have not had sort of like a guidance like I have had on the internet or through pop culture, I guess.
And who were your guides on the internet?
So many people, I guess all the Tumblr accounts I followed when I was like younger, people like Anthony, which is quite funny now because I guess not funny, but he's like obviously kind of like right wing and like very sort of gone off the rails, but all the sort of like iconic internet personalities from that era, I guess.
Yeah. And how do you think gay culture has changed though, from you growing up looking at and pulling on Tumblr and all of these things that in a bizarre way are sort of coming back in terms of those references, but how did you feel about revisiting some of those things? Are they still relevant today?
I think so. I think it's definitely a lot more open now, and I think focusing on the 2000s made it sort of like it affirmed why I wanted to do it, and also taught me a lot more, because obviously when I was like younger I was like looking at like, Girls Loud videos like these men with their tops off, and I was like, oh my god, that's like so hot, but not knowing like how to verbalize that or what that meant for me. So I think revisiting that was quite, it was interesting. It was definitely quite a full circle moment, I guess.
And Danny, just picking up on the Girls Aloud topless dances, in terms of looking at masculinity and what that means, is what's your view on that sort of, I guess, vision or idea of masculinity that has been fed to your generation?
Well, I think it's something that was maybe a bit of a revelation for me when we started to learn about gender at CSM, which was the idea of gender as performance. And I think maybe, I mean, I don't know, I can't speak for my whole generation, but I think like in terms of realizing that and being lucky enough to be taught about that, that was a big moment. And I think maybe some people are starting to realize that a lot more, and that obviously certain groups, but I think maybe that allows a lot more for kind of subversion and being able to play with that. But yeah, I mean, it took a long road to get there, but I'm really glad I now realise that.
And how has it changed? Because you looked at gangsters, and tell us a little bit about the kind of, I guess, the codes of dress that were of particular interest to you whilst doing your research.
Well, I started, so mine was my sort of research started post-war interwar America, North America. And so sort of 1918 to present day. And of course, it was a time where it was much more gendered. And also it was a time of kind of great masculine instability, particularly in terms of dress. There was, mass unemployment during the Great Depression and also post-war. And so in terms of using dress and uniform to define one's masculinity and define one's masculinity through success and financial success, that was kind of disbanded, and also loss of military uniform as well. And so it's a really interesting time in terms of gender expression and dress, or it was to me as well. But and then suddenly you have these very sort of flamboyant and fashion interested men, gangsters, who were being plastered all over media networks and things like that, and which sort of by history should have gone against what lots of people like they would associate consumption with as a feminine activity and a feminized activity, but because of the kind of violence of these men and their hypermasculinity, it was sort of made okay. And then it came in tune with the growing capitalist society as well. Yeah, so it's a very interesting period.
It is, but I think also what is quite significant is that when we talk about masculinity, which we've just started on as a subject, is when we talk about fashion and masculinity, what garments are we often talking about, do you think? Because I'm interested in the fact that they're quite often we rush to tailoring, we rush to suiting, we rush to those kind of quite, I guess, stereotypical, powerful garments, which is something that's been challenged in recent years with the kind of, the way that Silicon Valley power players are dressing. So the suit is kind of having a bit of an identity crisis, I think. And I was interested in the shows. I didn't see an awful lot of suits or tailoring. That could be partly to do with the season. It could be partly to do with just the mood in the air. But did any of you kind of think about these kind of ideas of traditional masculine codes within the menswear shows that weren't really being met? Federica, what do you think? Because your magazine it was a print publication looking at gay culture, fashion and art, but more specifically, what about, because there's a lack of clothing in your magazine too, right?
There is, and that's what I kind of took from the collection as well. There was a lot of skin, and I really appreciate that, because that's something that I really liked. There was no many clothes, or even the styling was really risque, and that's something that's what I like, really, just making something yours, and that kind of nudity and like kind of vulnerability of the models and the man the designer are thinking of. I think that was great and really different.
So nakedness to you is this idea of vulnerability, because I think what's interesting about what Bailey said about those dances in those music videos, it was actually the opposite of that, right? It's a kind of a strength, it's a kind of showing off of, and now we're kind of coming around to an idea perhaps that you're talking about, where nudity is this idea of vulnerability. Is that the kind of thing that you believe?
Well, not necessarily, but I feel like if you compare it to a suit, as we were talking earlier, like power dressing, I feel like that's a really powerful disconnect, and that's kind of the polar opposite of what a Savile Row suit symbolizes.
Yeah. Zaina, what does power dressing for a man look like to you?
I don't think that really exists anymore. First, like I think, especially now, I think things have become the fluidity of things have become so normalized, especially within the fashion weeks and the collections that come out, that I just don't think that there's like a specific definition for what power dressing should look like for a man. I think it's more about the person that's wearing it and their identity and what they feel most powerful in. I think that's a much more interesting relationship than necessarily defining what power dressing should look like or how to define it.
And culturally, would you say there's a difference perhaps in how people would interpret this idea of what power even means?
What do you mean?
Because your film obviously focused on Egypt, right? And the kind of the story, or the, I guess, culturally how that is influenced, or how we look at what women with Egyptian culture, I'd say. What was your film kind of trying to capture?
Well, I think, well, for me personally, I'll go back to exactly what I was saying. It's more about kind of normalizing different kinds of identity, and identity, especially in terms of fashion, and kind of exploring this idea of being more fluid, or being more masculine, or being more feminine is not something that's necessarily defined by a specific way of, or a specific form of dressing, but it's more about the energy and the person that wears it. So that's kind of my approach, and it's kind of about normalizing different ways of also thinking about or defining what power dressing should look like, or feminine dressing should look like as well.
Sure.
So that's kind of what that's my approach, or my take on fashion and dress in general, and style.
Yeah. And in a wider sense, though, why is it that you think the fashion industry is largely quite resistant to that? Because we still have menswear and womenswear departments, right? We still have this idea of menswear shows, womenswear shows. There are still design teams that are organized in this very binary way. Why do you think no one has kind of really fully embraced this idea of fluidity? That is obviously something that at St. Martin's, we're kind of spoiled, because it's celebrated as soon as you walk through the barriers. There is this kind of, I guess, people take off some of those social codes or social rules, if you like. So we're kind of all in this bubble where, you know, those things don't quite exist. But I've always been fascinated in how that never really translates widely enough for there not to even be a validity for a discussion like this. The fact that we're still talking like this, I think, indicates that there is this resistance. Why do you think there is that resistance, Zaina?
I mean, I think exactly what you just said. It's because socially, what's normal beyond the bubble of being in a fashion school is still the cues of a man must dress in a specific way and a woman must dress in a specific way. Like that barrier for the people that don't necessarily exist within the fashion industry, that's also here or in the West particularly, they don't have that level of thinking, or they don't think that way. They still believe that men should dress a specific way and women should dress a specific way. And I think it's a matter of it taking its time and spreading properly.
Yeah. Daisy, what do you make of all of this? The idea that the bubble we're in encourages a very open-minded kind of outlook on the world, but that's an outlook that sometimes isn't always met by the people that you will go on to collaborate with or work with or see.
Yeah, no, I completely agree about the whole bubble thing. I remember there's quite a bit of a culture shock when you've been at CSM for a while and then you go into a space that's not as engaged with that sort of thing, and we'll just start speaking about stuff and people just have no idea what's going on, but not in a way of just not knowing, but they just don't understand some things. And I think from having friends or family who will see the CSM shows every year and be like, what is that? Like, be so confused by something going on, and you're like, no, it's incredible, like appreciate, you know, the like detail if it's like knit or print or something like that, you know. And I think that's a thing that I have to constantly remind myself, is that it's because I surround myself with people who are in the know. It's not that everyone is in the know, and it will be that way when you go and work. Some places there will be this difference. And I think something else that always comes to mind when you talk about this binary of, you know, women's wear and men's wear, and how it's not always been, I think, well, not accepted, but kind of on some levels, we've still got the separate shows, is perhaps the financial aspect and them just wanting money. These big brands thinking if you've got separate, you've got the design, you've got accessories, you've got shoes, you've got all of that, and it's more money if it's separate. And sadly, that's the way a lot of the world is thinking when it comes down to fashion.
So it's quite a cynical kind of capitalist endeavor, this kind of idea of appealing to everybody or trying to catch everybody. Because I was actually really interested in the recent the BA show here, that there were a couple of menswear designers, actually, you know, students from the menswear pathway that were making women's wear, and vice versa. So there is that kind of sense of challenging, I guess, some of those rules. But I wanted to actually, let's just have a look at Shek Lung's collection, who graduated from the MA here last year, because he called his collection Quiet Masculinity. And I wanted to know what you guys made, not only of Shek's collection, but what we think that even means. Quiet masculinity. What are we expecting to see? Federico, what's quiet masculinity to you?
Well, I'm guessing, as I see it, it's something quite, I would say something totally opposite compared to toxic masculinity, something more, well, I guess some fragile, but it's not really the right word, I don't think. Something more sensitive, I guess.
Yeah. Bailey, what do you think?
It makes sense, but
I think, I guess, like, what I think when I think of that is like the opposite. Is like when you've got like, the football at the moment, that's quite like a loud masculinity. It's very in your face, sort of like jeering and like whatever, which can be, it's like hot, but also like there's a lot of like grossness about it. And then I think on I guess the opposite of that is sort of the timidness, and as Federico was saying, the fragility, and maybe like the sort of not the rigid stereotyping and things like that.
Because I wonder whether it's the actual design of these garments quite often is still very binary. It's women's wear, it's menswear, but it's in the packaging of it, it's in the communication of it, which is what you've all been studying on all of your different courses. It's what we do. That's where the things become more fluid, and that's where people get a bit more playful about, okay, well, let's put this garment on a different person or in a different context. And for me, I think this idea of quiet masculinity, the way Shek's done it in this film, is obviously it's done in a pretty, I guess, quite basic vanilla way, you know, showing a man crying, for example, showing a man with tears running down his face in kind of loose shirting with this daylight kind of haziness. It's very dreamlike. So I think for me, that's probably what this idea of quiet masculinity means. But I don't know whether it just fulfills some of those quite problematic stereotypes that exist anyway that we're all trying to challenge, which is that, oh, men crying, wow, that's a thing. When really what we, I guess, should be trying to do is just, it's not a thing. Why are we singling it out? But I guess, did any of you come across any in your research for your project? Like Daisy, tell us a bit about your project, because it has such powerful imagery that comes with what you looked at. Tell us a little bit about how those images shaped the way you've gone on to think about gender and sexuality.
Yeah, well, so my thesis looked at the Sukuban, and I looked at sort of concepts surrounding Japanese girlhood and the initiation of the schoolgirl in Japanese society in the earlier 20th century before they emerged, and then moved on to look at how that image was distorted by Japanese film industry, and then has contributed to this sexualized ideal of a Japanese schoolgirl. And I guess before I went into this, so the Sukuban, I recognized this image of a, you know, seraphic sailor suit wearing schoolgirl with a weapon or being somewhat violent. You think of like Tarantino's Go-Go Yubari is a much more Western, you know, representation. But when I started doing my research, things kept coming up, and I just kept seeing more and more about what we can attribute to what essentially was an exploitation of like powerful female, powerful young girls who Japanese society were threatened by, and so decided to distort them and sexualize them. And so I think that's something that I can think about now when I look at things and think, oh, has this been something that's been turned around and was actually meant to be something different originally? And I think you can see that in narratives, and a lot of designers, they'll look at things that have been exploited and they use that as inspiration. And obviously sexuality is like a big thing for a lot of people to discuss in their work, because it plays such a large part in people's lives and defining who they are, or for them to define themselves against. So yeah, I guess that's kind of, yeah.
And so what's interesting about your research, I guess, is that it goes on to unpick how film or popular culture, film, music, television, fashion now, really changes the way we all think about certain things or certain people. So I wondered kind of what you all thought generationally for you guys has really shaped the way we think about gender and sexuality. Again, that's a very broad question, but are there any specific examples of people that you think are really challenging this today in a way that is quite healthy? Because I know quite often, you know, pictures of Harry Styles carrying a Gucci handbag is quite often presented to us as this big heroic statement. You know, we're all meant to be really thankful that this is happening. But of course, you know, that's a very common sight on most fashion canvases, not most, not all, but generally that is a very kind of low level aspiration, I think, for all of us, if we're trying to break down gender binaries. Are there any people that you think are doing a really good job at really challenging the way that we think about gender and sexuality within fashion? Must be someone. They might not be designers, they could be photographers, they could be filmmakers, because I think what Daisy's kind of hinting at is that the power of the image, the power of the packaging of something is kind of where maybe some of the things that we're trying to undo need to be undone. Because Zanny, you looked at Peaky Blinders. How do you think that TV show, which started in 2013, I believe, and is still around today, how has that gone on to either confirm or reshape certain stereotypes about masculinity?
Well, I think because, I mean, that show kind of fascinates me because it's often marketed as being quite progressive and because they discuss men's mental health and because there are apparently these strong female characters in it. But I mean, really, to me, and I think to a few other people, it's, you know, it's this kind of celebration of cis het white male kind of, you know, toxic masculinity. And I think because I interviewed a designer in the Netherlands for my research who makes clothes, basically like the whole thing is inspired by the costume and the whole thing is a copy, and which I found fascinating anyway. And he spoke a lot about how sort of tough men want to be stylishly dressed again, and it's the whole thing feels like this kind of retaliative protection and like rebuilding of this masculinity, this idea of masculinity, which is being broken down by people promoting gender fluidity and people who you know are trying to go against that. It's this like very kind of retroactive screaming and yelping of like, don't worry, I'm man. And I feel like that show just sort of it encapsulates all of that for me. And the fact that the dress is so accessible because so many like bits and bobs of it can be very easily translated into contemporary menswear. That's what makes it so dangerous, is because it can be very easily picked up on and, you know, and bought and worn, and that idea of masculinity can be perpetuated and sort of used.
And when looking at masculinity, how much did women come up in that research for you, Zanny? The idea of what women think or look or how they dress in relationship to masculinity, how much does that come up?
Well, I mean, a lot, because one of the theorists who I use a lot is Raewyn Connell, and she discusses a lot how it's this masculinity is like everything has to be the antithesis of femininity. So it's the flight from the feminine, and so it's everything that, you know, femininity isn't, and a communication of that. And kind of the idea of, you know, male bonding and homosocial bonding as a kind of everything that men do and sort of promote. Well, obviously certain, not all men, sorry, not to use that phrase in that context, but that men with that particular masculinity or idea of masculinity is to kind of confirm to other men that that's what they are and that they're definitely not women. I think so femininity comes into it in that way.
I wonder if any of you looked at Maya Agayeva's collection. So Maya also showed as part of London Fashion Week. She graduated from the Royal College. And she called her collection unisex, which I thought was fascinating because it's a word I loathe and rarely use, just because it's just a bit naff. But I wondered if we think that unisex or gender non-conforming always has to mean minimalism when it talks about fashion. Because quite often, if we take the 90s idea of it, it is Helmut Lang, or it is a sort of a cis-born woman in a man's suit, or a suit looking kind of cut like a man's suit, or it's a man in a skirt. They're very kind of very clear cut, almost kind of like collage stereotypes, but do we always think it means minimalism? What do you guys think of that term, even unisex? Is it relevant?
It's funny that you say you don't like the term unisex, because I actually have heard like at least 2 people in the last week or so say that they hate the term unisex, and out in completely different contexts. But I think it, kind of gives this idea that it's like one gender, one sex, when in fact it's meant to encompass now, all different kinds of gender identities and all that. So I think as someone who's definitely a maximalist as well, I'm not usually interested in minimalism when it comes to fashion. And I think what's also interesting is I can't speak for everyone or everyone, but just the people that I know. But people that I know that are go by they them or are non-conforming, they usually are very expressive with their clothes in a very loud way and very like a wonderful way. And I just can't imagine seeing them wearing such sort of simple, minimal, even beautiful tailoring, that sort of thing, but still just can't really see them in clothes like this.
Yeah, because it's almost like there's sort of, whenever unisex or these sorts of collections are presented to us, there's almost a erasure of any sort of gender, which then makes it kind of something else. It makes it slightly other, slightly alien, and that is something exciting. But I think you're absolutely right, Daisy. I wonder why this idea of maximalism hasn't been embraced more within a collection that is presenting itself to everybody. I think there is kind of really room to do that. Let's look at Paolo Casana's collection, because again, talking about sexuality, I thought what was interesting about his work, and I wanted to ask you about this, Federico. He said to Sarah Moore of Vogue that he doesn't want it to be sexualized. So some of the sheer open heart shirts that he has, so lots of the shirting in his collection had these kind of gaping plackets. And he was very conscious to say that he didn't want them to be sexualized, but said it's an alternative way of feeling you're in control of the garment. And I wondered what you thought about what Paolo was doing. I think the video doesn't really give us as much as the images. So if we look at the images of the collection, that might help us a bit more. What did you all think of this? Federico, you tell us what you think of this.
Well, I definitely, the third look, for example, I don't know, I personally, it's quite sexy. Like, that's I see as a quite sexy. I think there's some sort of sensuality about it. And
is sexy and sensual the same thing to you?
Well, I guess sensual is more an attitude. Well, sexy is more in your face. Sexy is more outspoken and loud. Yeah, I guess you can really, from the models, they just they got a straight face. They're not really engaging.
Yeah.
But it's also I feel like just sort of got something to do with the attitude as well. And they're quite, I mean, looking for the models, they really, they look quite powerful, and that's quite central. They look in control no matter what they're wearing, no matter if they're wearing a huge coat, belted waist, or if they're wearing a shirt ripped halfway through.
Dana, what do you think of Paolo's collection?
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what is the difference between sexy and sensual to you?
For myself or for others?
No, for you.
There's a difference. I think if it's for you, then actually I think sexy and sensual, if it's a feeling that you have, then I think they can actually be quite like one of the same. Yeah. But I think sexy is a way that I would use to describe someone else, whereas sensual is an inner feeling. That's the difference, I think. Okay. But yeah, I don't think this is, personally, it's not giving me sexy or sensual vibes, personally. it's
Daisy,
nice.
what do you think?
Me, sorry.
Yeah.
It's me. I think what I really liked about some of his looks was, like you said about the his open heart chest pieces, was that so he has some of his looks are a lot heavier, and there's a lot more layering, there's a lot more going on, and then he's got the much simpler and lighter fabrics, sort of smaller bodysuits, or like the one that's showing, you can see kind of his nipple and everything, but yeah, it doesn't really feel sexy to me. It just feels, a lot of the smaller ones feel kind of delicate and dreamy, and this kind of other well, I think he called it Otherworld, was that the name of his collection? But I think we don't see this kind of look, this kind of feeling on in men's fashion as much. Like, I think we always see women in like traditionally like masculine silhouettes, like you said before, with like the big tailoring and suits, but we don't get this more, it's feminine, but it's not feminine, if that makes sense, because there's just like a daintiness to it, and it just feels like fantasy, dreamlike, and I really like it. I think it's really beautiful, but they still feel masculine. They don't make the model look any less masculine, if that makes sense. And I always feel like with a lot of masculinity, with a lot of my friends, or they can still dress in traditionally feminine clothing and still appear inherently masculine, because it's more about their attitude and how they just feel confident in themselves in wearing that, and it doesn't take away from feeling masculine wearing something like that. Does that make sense?
But in terms of your friends, because you reference them a lot, which is I wonder how much you feel that they are represented in the fashion media, because I'm always fascinated again in the fashion industry, and it's our job to communicate some of those ideals that we want everybody to take on, and that's going far and wide. That's kind of you to go back to your parents and kind of encouraging them to think differently. That's kind of our job. And I wondered if you thought the media was doing a good or not job at doing that. And when I say the media, I don't mean the Daily Mail. I don't even really mean Vogue and GQ. I kind of mean these kind of meant to be in the know style titles. Are they really kind of doing what they should be doing?
I think that I cannot speak for like certain people. I can't speak for how they feel, but obviously there's definitely a progression. It's getting better. There is obviously more, but I still feel there is still a level of exploitation going on with a lot of people, with a lot of parts of the industry where there's tokenism with using trans people or members of LGBT like us for their image, and not really paying attention to who they are and their identity and their story, but using it to kind of appear woke and of the moment, and so that their brand looks like they're on trend, and not actually paying their due diligence to these people and the role that they play in the creative industry.
So a lot of the activism feels like window dressing.
Yeah, I think which is, a lot of the time it does feel like
especially
that.
I think during Pride Month, it's quite a good time to walk down your local high street and look at the way that certain, all companies, all the way from Greggs through to Gucci, have tried to have some sort of riff off of these values, which I always struggle with, because they're values that I want them to have all year round, all the time.
Yeah.
I think the idea of these kind of singular months are inherently kind of problematic in themselves, because it implies that you just focus on that group for that month and then we'll move on to another one. But there's a lack of humanity in what you're saying. I guess you're also kind of riffing off of some of the recent allegations that have come out about certain labels and the way that certain groups have felt mistreated and abused in the most kind of crudest sense. But again, I wonder, how do all of you, Bailey, how do you feel about this? This idea of the responsibility of you as an editor, you've made a magazine, to represent a group of people. A couple of you have been very careful to say, I am speaking on myself. I'm not speaking for anybody else, which I think is fascinating as a generation, that you're so hyper conscious not to speak on someone else's behalf. Bailey, what do you make of all of this sort of, I guess, cultural politics?
Yeah, I completely agree with Daisy. I think that a lot of the sort of stuff that's come to light recently with like the label that we're referring to, it's quite sad, because I think you rally behind these people who you think are doing a good job and are doing the work that should be done, and then it turns out that actually it's nothing of the sort, and it's just a load of bollocks basically. So I think it is, I guess it's the job of all of us to do what we can for ourselves and for the people around us that we think we can best represent, and then like just do our best. But I think, yeah, definitely there's a case of sort of like putting your money where your mouth is with these brands and like paying the models or everyone down the line, because the sort of the hierarchy sort of needs to go, in my opinion.
Mm. And how, I'm going to ask you each now individually as we're signing off, what kind of values are you going to take forward into your career? What is the thing that you're championing or hoping to potentially change or address with your work, Bailey?
I guess I haven't changed anything. I just want to make people laugh. I think with all the horrible stuff going on at the moment, I think some people do just need like a break to just have a giggle and like not take everything like so seriously, and like just sort of lose themselves in something that's like nicer to look at than like a horrible headline or something like that. So definitely that, and I guess encouraging people to be a bit more kinder. I don't know. So like pageant answer, isn't it?
You want to save the world, Miss Congeniality. Do you think that fashion is taken too seriously now then? Is that what you're hinting at?
Sometimes I think there are obviously going to be other certain designers who are always pushing the boat out and doing fun things. So I guess it's like a cycle. It'll come back around. It'll be like sillier again. But I guess if people are sort of pretending to like minimalism, that's not really my bag, so to speak.
No, we can tell from your room behind you. Daisy, what is it that you're going to kind of push forward in your work?
Oh God. I'm not really sure, to be honest. I've just been focused on graduating. I haven't really been trying to avoid thinking about the future. But I guess, yeah, just it's like basic. Just going to be like pageant answers, like having everyone, hope people stay open-minded, be inclusive. Obviously, to be that person that we know CSM is obsessed with sustainability, but that is a big thing for me, is always trying to be as sustainable as possible with things, because there's so much more going on outside of fashion than just fashion. There's so much more going on in the world. So I guess, yeah, all of that, and just hoping that we can change more minds as we go through fashion, change more people's perspectives, and get the younger generation, that they will grow up in a better, oh, it sounds so bad to say it like this, better world, but yeah.
You guys are so cheesy.
Yeah, but just thinking about when I was younger, the kind of things that I saw, and it's really nice. I have younger siblings and I have younger family members, and it's nice to think that when they are getting to the age where I was getting interested in things like that, because I have really young sisters, that there's just going to be more visibility for a lot of different things, and a lot of more things will be taught on a new level than what we've grown up with. So yeah, hopefully that will just keep going.
Zaina, what about you?
Yeah, like Daisy said, also just focusing on the fact that I just graduated, but for sure, like I'm quite actually interested in normalizing different kind of forms of gender and sexuality, but in the sense of like things that may be also foreign to mainstream media, or things that may kind of come from different cultures or different people. Like that's something that I feel personally in the industry, especially here in London and in other kind of main fashion capitals. It's very fake in terms of the inclusivity aspect of it, in the sense that it just becomes so liberal that anything else that may not be liberal is looked down upon, and that in and of itself becomes problematic, I think, as well.
Zanny?
It's a big question. I think that the thing that was the most important to me whilst doing my project, and also sort of in general, is like a feminist perspective on regressive masculinities, and trying to tear that down, and trying to tear down patriarchal kind of sentiments and thoughts and ways of living, and yeah, I think that's the most important thing to me.
Okay, very noble endeavor, very exciting. Federico, what about you?
Well, I don't know, I guess it's, oh yeah, I'm gonna just go cheesy as well. I guess just do what I believe in, and just do something that will, at the end of the day, will make me feel good.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well done all for graduating or getting so close to the end, because it's not a mean feat, especially with the year that we've just had. But I think what is exciting is that the last year will have completely scarred the way that you think going forward about this industry in a way that is permanent and really healthy, because a lot of you are giving, you know, those sorts of answers that are so big. You know, there are some really huge ambitions that you as a generation have, and that's really exciting. And I think the fashion industry has an awful lot of work to do to improve in every single one of the ways that you've just talked about. So I think, you know, the London Fashion Week designers that showed or were showing digitally, I think have managed to create something in what has been an exceptional year and a half. So on that level, what is interesting, I think, for us is that when we're looking at collections now, we're not really looking at whether they're good or not. I think we're assessing, how does this exist? Because I think just by existing, we should congratulate every single one of them for showing. But I do think we need to kind of maintain picking apart some of that window dressing that a couple of you have spoken about. You know, the idea of promoting or supporting marginalized people and cultures, it has to be completely authentic. And I'd say that that's something that every single one of you will definitely go on to do in your future careers, whatever you go on to do. Thanks so much for spending time with us. For more extensive Fashion Week coverage, please do visit showstudio.com and our YouTube, and subscribe and comment and let us know what you think of any of the discussions you've had. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.